Hello and welcome back, and today let's talk about some brand new Synology hardware. Seriously, how many times have I said that in the last month? 7, 8, 10? Synology are rolling out standard class NAS hard drives, the HAT3300 series, or the Synology Hard Drive Plus series. Now, we've already talked a lot about Synology's existing range of hard drives already, the HAT5300 or the 5310, and there's SAS-based ones and their SSDs as well. But all of those drives always had much more of a kind of enterprisey outlook. They were largely, and we'll talk about compatibility later on, kind of targeted towards that bigger end, that unified storage, kind of big old compete with Dell and, you know, NetApp and stuff like that for the kind of complete one brand solution. They're all in one package. But these aren't quite of the same ilk. And I'm going to come out this early doors, I'm not actually against these drives. Unlike the way the enterprise tier was rolled out with these drives and a lot of the messaging that was behind DSM, and more on that in a video in a couple of weeks, by the way, I felt that it wasn't great in the way it was rolled out. In the case of these drives, they sort of make a little bit more sense depending on what you're looking for. So first, let's talk about the spec. Let's get it out of the way. The HAT3300 are built on Seagate drives. They're not using Toshiba this time. There was the talk about maybe them possibly using the N300 series and the Toshiba non-ENT NAS drives there. But we've known for a while, and I've talked about it a little bit online in the comments, and I believe in one other video that we kind of worked out they were going to be using Seagate drives there, the Ironwolf series. So much like the HAT5300 using Toshiba MG ENT drives and using Synology Firmware on board, that is what we're going to see with these new drives. They're going to be built on the standard Seagate Ironwolf NAS drives, not the Pro series. Very important. That will come up later on. Now, they have got at launch 4 intended capacities there, 4, 6, 8 and 12 TB. There's also little bits and bobs floating around online for a 16 TB drive there. But again, no more information has come out on that one. Now, when it comes to the drive architecture, they are all 5400 drives with the exception of the 12. As we'll know, that's when you enter the kind of Helo seal drives there, with the helium sealing there, and the more to get more platters inside. And generally, they have to maintain a high performance anyway, so the 12 TB is going to be 7200 RPM. When it comes to cache, you're looking at 256 megabytes cache on board, although I think the 4 TB will probably a little bit less there. And they're all going to be conventional magnetic recording, your CMI, PMR, whatever is your flavor on that. In terms of durability, they're going to be 1 million MTBF, and again, when you're at this scale, MTBF isn't a great way to measure mean time between failure, because you don't really have the large-scale storage in the time there between swapping them out and the replacement service. But they do have the standard 180 TBW, the workload rate in there on the drives, as you would expect from a standard class NAS drive. And it's going to arrive with 3 years of warranty. But that has got a big TBC on the side, because Synology might go all out and put 5 years on these with their own firmware. But again, I couldn't get confirmation for that before this video. So based on the Seagate drives, I'd say 3 years, but also they might go with 3 years and 5 years on the enterprise drives to separate them on the portfolio. But again, I've got nothing confirmed on that. So why am I less uneasy about these than I may have been about the 5300 there from Synology? Well, it looks like this is not going to be a kind of my way or the highway hard choice option. Clearly, these are going to be drives that are going to be the Seagate drives, but with Synology firmware, and they're going to cost probably a fraction more because of it. And with Synology supplying these solutions potentially in a pre-populated state, but I don't know if they would go down that road for these drives. It's just allowing users who buy value series, who buy plus series, that don't go hyperscale, that don't go XS, that don't go 12, 16, 24 bay rack mount and above, to have a Synology choice. And the real important option there is that it looks like we've had several indications this is not going to be that their solutions can only have these drives. It looks like they're going to continue having systems that have got either a selection of WD or Seagate drives and these drives as well. And in that world, in that ecosystem, I'm much more on board with this, because home users that go for little, DS 920 plus Gavin there, he does not want to overspend on these drives. There are going to be people that just aren't going to go for these. They've bought Seagate or WD before, and they're going to lock in with those. They're totally cool with it. But I think as long as this remains an optional drive, I think this will bowl people over. People that would have gone Synology memory, that would have gone Synology accessory, may well go Synology drive there. And again, another thing worth bearing in mind with these drives is if you are going Rackstation, you may have been someone that wanted to go, you would have loved to have gone all in one brand, but you weren't able to because of the cost measures. At least with here, you can look at some of their 4, 8 and 12 bay rack mount options and go for a drive like this to keep it all in there along with those firmware updates. Now, why do I keep banging on about firmware updates? For those that aren't aware, Synology hard drives, because of the firmware there, you can, not only has it got firmware that is tailored towards Synology systems, whereas the firmware in normal NAS drives has to be a little bit, just a tiniest bit more loosey-goosey, because it's got to support different NAS drives and, be a little bit more open-ended in the file system and the read-write architecture of that OS. Synology drives, because they're going to be using the Synology system, it gives them just that little slither more to tweak that firmware to be a little bit more geared towards a specific system there. A specific architecture and platform there. But the other thing with the firmware updates is you can update the firmware from within the OS. Anyone that's had lots of drives, again, Seagate, WD, whatever, Toshiba, and you've got 8 or 12 drives in your system and you've had to update the firmware, you would have had to remove drives, power the system down, remove drives individually, put them into a dock, put them into a multi-dock perhaps, and then update that firmware one by one. There's the risk of, drop, physical damage, and then you've got dangers such as accidentally reinitializing a disk. So there's lots of little things along the way that might make that slightly less palatable. No firmware updates on hard drives aren't as important as it might be on, say, SSDs. You all followed the Samsung stuff that happened recently, right? It is still quite beneficial for hard drives to take advantage of that increased firmware, especially when you're updating drives over time and you have drives with different firmware inside. Now, the firmware updates on the Synology drives can be updated from within DSM. As we did some testing about 3 weeks ago, it's not quite, in my opinion, as seamless as they have dictated. So when you've got the drives inside a Synology system, if you've got, for example, a 12 bay and all 12 of those Synology drives inside have got a firmware update available, it will still need to power down and reboot the system. There's no way of avoiding that. So again, it is going to have to, not so much dismount, but it is going to have to update the firmware and restart that system and make the system, at least for a short period, inaccessible there. Also, with the drives, with the firmware update, something we've talked about before, whether this becomes a barrier with the HAT3300, as we have observed with the 5300S, is to do with trying to use the drives without the latest firmware. Now, hopefully there'll be something on screen here. We're doing some testing with the 1823XS, and we utilised a bunch of Synology drives inside, myself and Ed, and when we put them inside, the firmware on the drives needed updating, and we couldn't run the RAID with them. We had to update the firmware, or otherwise we couldn't use the drives. Now, again, that's not really a barrier when you think about it. You're just, yep, I've introduced this drive, I want the latest firmware, I want synchronicity, great. It's much like the firmware update on any NAS drive, but it's still, that's going to take a little bit of extra time. And when you've introduced this drive into a hot swap bay, maybe you're running the system, it's already live, it's got active current shares, and you're introducing the new drive for new storage space, it's a little bit annoying that you're going to have to power down the system in order to do it. Yes, it's way more convenient than have to remove all the drives periodically and update the firmware via a dock and a third-party system, but when you are just looking to inject a new drive and you've got spare drives on the shelf, you're just going to have to keep in mind that it is not just going to be a case of slot the new drive into the system, update that RAID, expand the RAID, get your extra storage, or replace an existing drive in RAID migration. You're going to have to update that firmware accordingly there. Now, as mentioned, I'm not anti these actually. These make a little bit more sense depending on Synology's presentation of them. But one question I have is to do with Seagate's Ironwolf health management and to do with Seagate's recovery service. Because if you go for a Seagate drive, you've got the additional kind of Smart Plus testing that's built into the Synology Storage Manager there that allows you to tweak, run extra tests where it does an extra layer of checks, much like Smart, but testing other variables as well from within the drive to check its health periodically. Now, there's no confirmation at this stage whether that's included. The second thing is to do, as mentioned, with the rescue recovery services, because all Synology NAS hard drives include data recovery services. Again, we've waxed lyrical about this on the channel before. It's the idea that you've got, in the event of your drive failing, within the first 3 years, the ability to send it off for software or even forensic level data recovery services. Yes, when you have multiple drives in a RAID array, that is going to be problematic to try to recover that data if it's one drive within a larger spectrum of drives, and therefore recovery possibilities are pretty slim because you're going to have to recover that drive and reintroduce it into the RAID configuration. But even in individual drives, the recovery rate is very, very high in Synology's reported figures. And in Seagate's reported figures, and I'd be very interested to know whether Synology drives are going to have these services included. I don't know the answer to that at this stage, but overall, I'm sort of okay with Synology releasing standard class drives as long as it's not foisted upon people, as long as compatibility lists don't suddenly get a little bit gappy, you know what I mean? And whether these drives start being start appearing on larger scale devices like the XS series on their compatibility list, whether these systems don't list Synology's own standard class drives. That will be a discussion for later on as well when this gets more rolled out over time, because I'd be very interested to see if the XS series that seemingly only have Synology drives on a compatibility list will suddenly also list these 3300 drives, which are originally Seagate drives to start with there. But that's everything we know right now about the HAT3300. What do you guys think? Because let's face it, when we've talked about Synology's hard drives on this channel, it has been quite a loud conversation with lots of different voices agreeing and disagreeing in multiple ways. And I'd be very interested to hear your point of view on these new drives and see how your point of view aligns or not aligns with my own. So let's find out. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Click like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to learn more. There's an article in the description going through a little bit more of the specifications that we'll update as soon as these drives roll out a little bit more. With regards to release, wouldn't be surprised if you see these drives within the next month or two, given the way information recently has appeared online for other Synology releases between it arriving on the scene and it eventually being released. So it wouldn't surprise me if that is something that's going to play out with these drives as well. So let me know what you think in the comments. Visit the links if you want to learn more, and use the free advice section and the free support community forum there, Ask NAS Compares, if you need help with your solution, ideally for home or business. But let's find out. But other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.